Yeah, so my symptoms started in September of 2020, and the first symptoms that I noticed were fatigue, and I was having some joint pain. The first time I noticed it, I was running outside in Elm Creek Park, and I was having to stop more often than I usually would. I normally would not have to stop, and I was having to stop every mile or so, which was very unusual. And then over the course of that next week, I was having more and more fatigue, I was getting some shortness of breath, joint pain, especially in my knees when I was going upstairs. And the last day that I was at work, before the symptoms really took off, I was feeling very short of breath. I had to stop and rest. After I saw my last patient for the day, I had my nurse take my temperature, and I didn't have a fever at that time, but still had to go and round in the hospital afterwards, and had to stop after each patient I saw and rest, which was not typical. And then that following evening, after I got home, it was a Friday, I started to feel really not well, and started to have like some shaking chills, and I checked my temperature, and then finally had a fever, and it was up to 104 that night.
Oh my gosh.
So I thought I had COVID initially, because I had joint pains, fevers, chills, shortness of breath. But I isolated in the upstairs spare bedroom, and kind of just like hung out there fevering, and trying to bring down fever with Tylenol and ibuprofen, and having lots of shaking chills. And then on Tuesday, went out and got the first COVID test, and it took a few days for it to come back at that point. And Wednesday, it still hadn't come back yet, but I was feeling very short of breath. I had a pulse ox, an oxygen monitor, and my oxygen levels were going down. They were in the low 90s. And so I went to the emergency room, and I said, hey, I have exposures at work. I'm seeing patients who have COVID. I think I might have COVID. I just got tested yesterday. The test isn't back yet. So they did a chest x-ray, and I had a lot of stuff in my lungs. And they said, it's probably COVID pneumonia. You just got tested yesterday. It's not back yet. We're not going to test you again. So I was like, okay. The test came back the following day, and it was negative. And I thought, oh, it's probably wrong. Like, I probably have COVID. And then I started to develop worsening pain in my joints, and then I developed a rash that was on my back and buttocks, because I've been laying in bed for this whole week. And I called a couple of my colleagues, and I said, you know what, something is not right here. And one of my colleagues ordered a more widespread respiratory virus panel, and went in and got that done, and a repeat COVID test, and those came back negative. And I was still having these fevers up to like 104 degrees despite Tylenol and stuff. And then one of my colleagues contacted my primary, who's also in the same group, and he said, like, look, you got to go into the ED in Minneapolis. So I went in, and about the time I was thinking that I had this rash and that things were not really adding up with COVID, but my cognitive abilities were not all the way on top. I was feeling really sick, and but eventually they got me into the hospital. They admitted me, and they were gonna. And I was starting to think, okay, this is really not adding up as COVID. Something else is going on here. And I had a bronchoscopy in the hospital, so they basically put a camera down into my lungs, and they were going to take some samples of some of the fluid that they saw in there. And I remember when I was waiting for the bronchoscopy, they said, okay, we're going to do conscious sedation, so you're going to be kind of out of it. You're probably not going to remember the procedure. And that was the last clear memory I had for some time. And I had some snippets of memory after that. But apparently during this bronchoscopy, things started to bleed and really got out of control. So they brought me up into the ICU. And I do remember them saying to me something along the lines of, we can either intubate you now, we can either put you on a breathing machine now, or we can do it emergently later. Is it okay if we do it now? And I remember giving assent to that. And then the next thing I remember was when I was waking up. So I was intubated and sedated, and I was on the breathing machine for about 10 and a half days. And during that time, I found out later how things had been pretty touch and go for a while. And they ultimately needed to put me onto my stomach, which is called proning, because I was not breathing very well when I was on my back and things. Ultimately, did well. They gave me a lot of prednisone and many medications to suppress my immune system. And then when I woke up, I remember I was in the ICU, and there's certainly a lot of confusion and trying to figure out what had happened. And the first night after they extubated me, after they took the breathing tube out, I remember having delirium, so I was very confused and like hearing people talking, and it was very kind of frightening to be in that situation. But then there's this other part of me that's like, I've seen my patients in this, so there's kind of this very weird duality to experience that. And so that night was really hard, but then after that, things have been going well. I was treated initially with some stronger medications than was on rituximab, and responded very well to rituximab, and I have not had any recurrence of disease since then. So it's been kind of a long and slow recovery process. But things have gone really well, and I'm not quite back up to where I had been previously, but I'm able to exercise again, and I'm doing really well, and I haven't had rituximab now for a little over a year, so I responded really good to treatment. But the recovery was prolonged, and I think one of the challenging things too is being in COVID and being really immunosuppressed. My rheumatologist made it abundantly clear that I was not to be back at work, so I was doing a lot of video visits with my patients and stuff, and it was good because we can do that, and that was an option. 5 years ago, who knows what would have happened.
Yeah.
But it's also tough to be kind of not having any human contact for a really long time. So the recovery, I think, is long, and then I think the other part of it that was hard for me is I was an All-American collegiate athlete, and I was very active, and even like the week before I started feeling sick, like I did a 10K pushing my two daughters who were 2 and 9 months when I went into the hospital at the time in the jogging stroller. So I was very active, and seeing how much that changed has been challenging. So like seeing the difficulty. So I think in addition to the physical aspects of the condition, which are challenging, there's a lot of mental and emotional aspects too. And one of the things that I did have a hard time with was, waking up in the hospital and having gone through all this. And I absolutely recommend therapy for people who have gone through things like this. It certainly benefited me, but even having like these sort of vivid flashbacks and recollections of being in the hospital and feeling like I'm waking up and can't breathe. And so therapy was extremely helpful for me to organize some of these thoughts, and it's treated almost like a PTSD type of a situation. And I found that really, really helpful, and had almost immediate benefits from some of that. So lots of things. But now I'm sitting more than 2 years out, and I think one of the things about going through an experience like this is it definitely gives you a new perspective on things. And I think some of the things that maybe I took for granted, or even the amount where I allocate my time, I think has shifted. So I think even though I wouldn't want anybody to go through this, it has given me, maybe some new perspectives or a silver lining to the experience.
I think you have to look at it that way sometimes to get through the next phase. And I think I missed, you were diagnosed while you were in a coma, correct? You came out and they had diagnosed you.
Yes, I was definitively diagnosed. Yeah, the labs and stuff came back when I was intubated and sedated. Yeah.
So what form of vasculitis do you have?
I have granulomatosis with polyangiitis, primarily affecting my lungs. One of the things following my diagnosis of vasculitis was doing a lot of remote work, and I did not mount an immune response to the COVID vaccines. So I ultimately received this other injectable medication called Evusheld, which was being used a lot, although not as much now with the newer variants. But that ultimately allowed me to feel like I had some amount of protection. There were antibodies directed against COVID that you would get injected. And that allowed me to return to work in person. It with my N95 mask and the face shield and the whole deal. But that it was great, and being able to see people again and interact. And one of the reasons that I love my job is being able to talk to people. So being able to see people in person was a big deal, and then gradually have been working my way back up, and I'm up to about 3/4 time now, which has been great. And don't know if I'm going to go back to full time in the foreseeable future, because it gives me more time with my kids.
Yeah.
And, in terms of looking forward, I think in hearing everybody's story, I think these types of experiences do give us just a different perspective on how we want to live our lives, and maybe even like a sense of humility that otherwise we might not have had, and that sense of confronting mortality that is not pleasant to learn, but I think it does give a different perspective. So I think that's really what I try to think about, and really try to prioritize what I want to do, and prioritize the time that I get with my kids, and I think that has been a positive impact of this condition. I think it also hopefully makes me a better physician too, and I think being able to tell a patient who's having a hard time, like I know this sucks, like I've been there, and this is really hard, and even to say this is something that helped me to reframe this in my mind. I think sometimes that can be really, really impactful. And I think one of the things with a lot of conditions that are not as common, like vasculitis, is this sense of isolation. And I think programs like what we're doing now, and Vasculitis Foundation and these types of outreach groups, I think are really helpful for people. And just knowing that you're not alone, and what you went through, you're not the only person who's gone through that, I think has been helpful. In terms of looking for the future, I'm hopeful that I won't have a recurrence for the type of vasculitis GPA. For people who have the antibody status that I have, and my demographics being a little bit younger and male, I have a high risk of recurrence. So I think there's always this part in the back of my mind that's like, okay, I have like a cold, but like, is this a cold or is this something more? Or like, maybe I exercised a little bit more vigorously and I'm sore. Okay, did I just work out too hard? This feeling I used to embrace, like, yeah, I worked out really hard, I feel great. But now I'm like, well, maybe I pushed it a little too hard.
And that affects you mentally, day to day, not knowing what tomorrow will bring. I mean, that is exhausting mentally.
Yeah,
so.
Yeah. And I think that's one of the things, that sense of, your own fragility or your own mortality. But you could also say, like, I could get in a car accident tomorrow too, right?
Yes.
It could have nothing to do with vasculitis. And so I think you sort of have this false sense of control over things, and conditions like this maybe make you recognize you don't have that sense of control that you might want. So I'm hopeful I won't have a recurrence. And one of the things that like many of us here, we had prolonged hospital stays, and one of the things that really motivated me was getting out to see my kids. And my daughter's birthday is October 30th. I really wanted to get out of the hospital before her birthday, and I was discharged on the 28th, so I was like really happy for her 3rd birthday. But I want to see my kids grow up. And I think beyond even the threat to my own mortality and stuff, I think that I wanted to see my kids grow up. And so that's been like a really powerful motivator for me, and to reframe, what's important in my life.